First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri country of the Kulin Nation that we are on and pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. AI is coming for us not just in life, but in the throes of death as well. From the study of Greco-Roman antiquity to fiction and virtual autopsies, automation has the capacity to change how we interact with life and how we face death. We've got 4 exciting speakers to speak to us about diverse ways of interpreting this topic. You can see from the big screen, we're doing a little bit more traditional format here, 4 papers, and you will actually be able to see the PowerPoint presentations that they will be giving us, which I understand are important with all 4 of them. So, and we will also try Slido again for questions, but there will also be a roving mic around. So if you don't want to try Slido, you can just do the old-fashioned thing and put your hand up as well. And we'll save the questions for the end. I will just briefly introduce the 4 speakers now and then invite each of them to speak. So the first speaker is Dr. Tatiana Bur, who's a lecturer in classics at ANU, and she's the author of the forthcoming monograph, Technologies of the Marvelous in Ancient Greek Religion. And this work provides the basis for her presentation today, Humans, Gods, and Machines in Greco-Roman Antiquity, which reminds us that automation has been a keen interest of humanity for millennia. The second speaker is Associate Professor Roslynn Haynes from UNSW, who's published 5 books that connect science and literature, among many other books. She's currently writing a monograph on AI as depicted in film and fiction to explore the interrelations between law, technology, and death. Rather than investigating AI per se, she's examining what AI tells us about humanity. Associate Professor Elizabeth Stevens is the third speaker, and she teaches cultural studies at the University of Queensland. Her most recent book is A Critical Genealogy of Normality, and today she explores the use of AI in prolonging life at its very beginnings. But interestingly, her object of study is the neonatal incubator of the past, not the pediatric wards of the present. And the final speaker, Dr. Marc Trabsky, is an associate professor in law at La Trobe University and a current DECRA fellow. He's the author or co-editor of 3 books on law and death. He's an affiliate member of the ARC Center of Excellence for Automated Decision-Making and Society. And today he will speak about the virtual autopsy and the importance of human-machine relations. So our first speaker is Tatiana.
Okay. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here amongst such distinguished people. It's a real pleasure for me to be giving this talk today. So, ideas of inanimate objects that move by themselves, the kinds of things we've been talking about today. Objects that are endowed with thought and that have capacities of their own have held cultural attraction since Greco-Roman antiquity. Some of these, especially those found in the mythic corpus, are divinely manufactured, but others, both in myth, but then also in history, philosophy, and eventually the burgeoning mechanical tradition, are resolutely human-made. What I will try to do today is to whiz through some of the evidence surrounding ideas of AI and automation in the ancient Greek tradition, thinking about how man, human, and divine fit into this picture. And then along the way, offer some thoughts about the use to which the classical conversations can be put as predecessors to some of the complex conversations happening today around human-machine relations. So some of the questions that are in the back of my mind today are: what kind of teleological stories can we write about ancient automation and AI? And to what extent are ancient ideas and mechanical models building first on each other in the ancient world, and then how do those ancient ideas speak to modern conversations? AI narratives in the Western canon typically look first to, This was going all by itself. Ooh. There we go, automated technologies. AI narratives in the Western canon typically look first to Greek epic, the great oral poems of the 8th century BCE, authored under the names such as Homer and Hesiod. The Iliad, for example, twice mentions self-opening doors, like the kinds you find at the supermarkets, that give access to cloudy Olympus. These are known as the gates of the Horai. There are then a few self-animated objects clustered around the lame god and divine blacksmith Hephaestus and his workshop in Book 18. Now, this god is said to have been busily working on forging 20 tripods that would make their way to the divine assembly and back again of their own accord, for example. Now, the text stresses the fact that Hephaestus doesn't just magic these tripods into motion, but he attaches wheels in order to enable the motion, which is quite interesting in terms of inserting the mechanical into the myth. These tripods are described as a wonder to behold. Hephaestus' workshop also has self-pumping bellows, which would offer significant advantage in the construction process. And finally, wandering around the workshop are golden handmaidens who are said to possess mind, voice, and strength. Now, we're not told explicitly in the text who made these handmaidens, only that they respond to and support their master. The qualities of the handmaidens, incidentally, are the very same qualities that Pandora, the first female, also receives in the Hesiodic tradition. Just as Pandora is made of earth and water to be like a real woman, so Hephaestus' golden handmaids are like living young women. We're in similar territory here, of course, to things like the myth of Pygmalion and the statues of the mythical craftsman Daedalus, who are said to be so lifelike that you had to chain them down so that they didn't run away. And all of these examples in this category, the yellow category, I think are united by the fact that actually there's nothing remotely mechanical about them. So the same could be said for the giant bodyguard made of bronze named Talos, who's on that beautiful vase there, who patrolled the island of Crete. And we can see just how muscled he is and how kind of hyperhuman he is. There's nothing mechanical about Talos there either. In the Odyssey, we hear of self-propelled intelligent ships. These ships, it is said, have no pilots nor steering oars, but the ships of themselves understand the thoughts and the minds of men. And they know the cities and rich fields of all people, so they know where to go. And because of that, they have no fear of harm or ruin. So as we're progressing through these categories, we've sort of moved from an object moving or acting of its own accord to an object having independent mind and capacities, to now objects acting as a sort of extended mind of the human, and thanks to these capacities, the object then exhibiting emotion, so in this case having no fear. And a final example from the epic tradition takes us into slightly different territory, and that is in Book 6 of the Iliad. A group of Trojan women lay a robe on the knees of Athena, meaning at her cult statue, in a context where cult statues were tangible, epiphanic embodiments of divine presence. Athena is said to reject the priestess's accompanying prayer by throwing her head backwards. Right, so this is a beautiful range, I think, of imaginative thinking about objects, humans, and gods, about mind, extended mind, about divine, human, and object agencies. It tells us, however, very little about ancient mechanics and mechanical automata. The question is then, to what extent does this constitute a blueprint for then what's to come when the discipline of mechanics, which will develop about 400 years after this, catches up with the imagination, as it were? And then relatedly, should classical antiquity be credited for, or perhaps made responsible for, modern robotic technologies and the possible implications there? It has certainly been a popular way of thinking, both in the media and in the academy. And in these takes on the material, there is a general fixation, actually, on one category, on this category, of the kind of proto-robot, which, it must be said again, none of these are ever called an automaton in text. So let me introduce a different slab of evidence to see how that fits onto this blueprint or complicates the blueprint. In the 4th century BCE, the philosopher Aristotle very briefly imagines a world where tools perform their intended function without human assistance. So if every tool could perform its own work when ordered or by seeing what to do in advance, if thus shuttles wove and quills played harps of themselves, master craftsmen would have no need of assistance and masters no need of slaves. This is a quite incredible passage, but needless to say, the idea never really takes off, nor was it entertained in philosophical texts at any more length than it is here. It's a kind of utopian meditation around labour, and it probably fits, I think, here in this category with Hephaestus's objects, who are also helping out in terms of labour. Next, we might like to think about the well-known object of the deus ex machina. Now, this theatrical crane, used largely to introduce divine figures into Greek tragedy, has been relentlessly analysed as a sort of intrusive plot device. But I suggest that actually we could put it into the category of visual epiphany, and that it provides one of the earliest models of using mechanics to visualise the divine in Greek antiquity. So I've popped it there. Now, as I've said, Greek mechanics doesn't become a formalised discipline until the mid-4th century BCE. That doesn't mean that mechanics didn't exist, but the discipline itself didn't exist. At that time, we start getting entire texts dedicated to the construction of mechanically self-animated objects or automata. Only one of these manuals is extant for us today, and that one comes from a little bit later, from the 1st century CE, written by an author called Hero of Alexandria. And in this text, the author refers to his predecessors so that we know that the tradition existed at least a couple of generations before. In his On Automata Making, Hero of Alexandria describes 2 types of automata. The first, which he calls moving automata, are a category of shrine, and he says they can take any presentation on the outside, but the example he will give us is a shrine to Dionysus. At the top there, this is one reconstruction. There are many reconstructions in lots of technology museums these days, with maenads, who are the female followers of Dionysus, whirling around. And the little statuette at the top is animated in various ways. The perhaps paradoxically named stationary automaton is called stationary because the actual object does not move forward and back, it stays stationary. The only thing that moves is the little theatrical display in the box at the top. Elsewhere, in a different text, a text on the science of pneumatics, Hero describes animals that will drink thirstily when water is presented to them, just using a basic siphon, birds that sing, just using air displaced in a tube, and miniature temples with self-opening doors. That's what you have on the very left-hand side of the slide. Among very many other objects, which we think were probably made either for dedication, for religious dedication for the gods, or for use at a kind of private dinner party or symposium. Now, the self-opening temple doors is really a very useful object for the teleological approach, as it speaks so clearly to the gates of the Horai that Homer describes. Fantastic news. But otherwise, mechanical texts on automata making should probably put over there in that category, as they are concerned with theatrics, with religion, and with spectacle. A final category of object is that of the automaton used in religious procession, which seems to kick off in the Hellenistic period, when wealthy rulers of the time organised really big, really lavish public festivals and used these large self-animated machines, making their way through the cityscape to make political statements about the abundance of their own regime at the time. The earliest evidence for this describes the use of a self-animated snail, which led the procession again to the god Dionysus in 309, 308 BCE. And then a little bit later, at some point in the 270s, Ptolemy II organised in Alexandria what must have been one of the most lavish festivals in antiquity. It was this totally over-the-top curated explosion of art and nature, combined under the guiding forces of Dionysian indulgence and Ptolemaic wealth. That parade had at least a couple of technologically animated elements, a statue again of a divine figure, Nysa, who would stand up, pour a libation, which is a religious act, and sit back down again, as well as a cave from which poured never-ending springs of milk and wine. Okay, that's my whiz through the evidence. At the outset of the talk, I wanted to delve into some questions about whether real mechanical automata were constructed to fulfill the same purpose as mythical automata found in ancient epic and other places too. This is obviously just a limited range of all the evidence that we have. In other words, we wanted to see whether the kind of automaton that Aristotle imagines might substitute slavery is the same kind of automaton that Hero makes in his manuals, and whether either of these are in fact looking back to Hephaestus's tripods or forward to the modern robot. One of the trends to come out of this, I think, is that there's actually a really curious disjunct between what's imagined in ancient myth and what is then constructed in the technical texts. Notably, there's a striking resistance to using real mechanics to technologically animate the human body, or we might say to create robots or androids of any sort. The divine body is there. The divine body is never animated. Objects of the divine are animated. But divine bodies are treated very differently in Greek religion and in Greek art. While such ideas are entertained in literature, Pandora or the giant Talos are not what Hero of Alexandria ultimately chooses to describe. Aristotle's dream of having self-animated objects to replace slaves doesn't take off in any significant way in the ancient mechanical tradition. The kinds of automata that we do get in Greco-Roman antiquity are, for example, those large spectacle machines used in religious procession, smaller objects used for religious dedication or display at a private event, machines that embellished theatrical performance. We might even go as far as to point to animated cosmological models, such as the better known Antikythera mechanism. And I end this little section on the Antikythera mechanism for two reasons. This object brings up some really interesting questions about whether then the cosmos, the entire cosmos, could have been conceived as a machine, and when would be the earliest time that that started to happen. I also end on this object because it is an object that, when it was pulled out of a shipwreck in 1901, completely reconfigured the conception of ancient technological capabilities. And I use this object then to stress that the choices behind the choices that Hero makes in his text are not based on a lack of technical sophistication. Instead, the external presentation within which scientific properties are embedded in antiquity betray something about the mindset behind ancient automation technologies. So in reconsidering the relationship between mythic and mechanical automata, I think we are also faced with an opportunity to rethink the underlying mission of ancient automation technologies. Ancient automata proved to be a useful object for thinking through notions of innovation and progress. A culturally sensitive investigation into ancient automata is an opportunity to contemplate the largely financial priorities that drive our own modern technological advancements, perhaps. To the irritation of some great scholars of the past, ancient automata never fulfilled the economic, frankly capitalistic potential which historians at the time perceived that they could have. Automata in classical antiquity worked using a different kind of currency, wonder and amazement. In the eyes of its ancient audience, a well-designed, well-constructed automata will arouse wonder and shock in its viewers. This is the vocabulary that Hero of Alexandria uses to describe the intentions of professional automata makers, and it's the vocabulary which resonates with the religious and performative context where we see these real machines deployed. Equally, however, the human and human labour cannot be completely disentangled from the creation of automata, and it's a paradox that already ancient authors were aware of. So Hephaestus's automatic tripods might act according to what the divine craftsman wants, but in terms of construction, they are no means the result of a wave of a magic wand. Homer's at pains to describe Hephaestus huffing and puffing to make these objects. Philosophical and technical texts also exhibit a self-consciousness about the role of the human in producing self-animated objects and the wonder that ensues. So it's the human mechanician's knowledge that is ultimately able to create responses in the machine through in the viewer through the machine. There are also then unspoken issues of human and machine that we can extract from these texts, I think. And one of the newest ideas that I have been working on that I would love to kind of throw open in the conversation is the idea of enslaved agents who would have held roles both in the construction but also in the deployment and repair of these objects, also acknowledging enslaved distributed cognition that goes into maintaining and disseminating technical knowledge in antiquity as in the present day. What are ancient automata then? Are they the stuff of myth and magic, or do they belong to the realm of serious scientific study, experiment and mechanical innovation? The ancient world certainly had machines, and even programmable ones. They flirted with the idea in literature and myth of human-like bodies being more artificial than natural, of intelligence residing in objects and not just in humans. But beyond these moments, the Greco-Roman mechanical tradition was not interested in giving artificial life to the human form. Perhaps more than devising a proto-robot, what ancient technological animation has to offer in modern conversations around AI and automation are more nuanced meditations concerning the priorities of scientific innovations, mechanical visualization, so seeing the machine, the labor and the knowledge all together, as well as the human hand, the mind and the capacity for the object to exert wonder on the viewer.
Sorry, it's already on. Well, we've just heard from Tatiana's fascinating talk that even in antiquity, people were intrigued with the question of what might constitute an artificial human. How would they think? How would they be controlled? How would they affect people? More recently, as IT research began to realise such scenarios, these questions became more urgent. The first response by novelists and filmmakers was expressed fear, the inability of humans to oppose the power and the unpredictability of AI, most often depicted as massive robots destroying individuals, society, and subsequently the planet. Now today, I'm not going to talk about what AI is or does or might do, but human responses to AI, the narratives that Malavika spoke of this morning. Today we have 4 broad groups of responses to AI. The unaware. Most of us are simply unaware of the extent to which we rely on, interact with, and are used by to provide data for AI. My iPhone now allows me to type whole text using only 1 or 2 letters for each word, and sometimes none at all. I just have to select the word offered. AI has built up a profile of expectation, which in most instances is appropriate and fine with me. But as we saw in a previous session, artistic works of all genres have been appropriated by AI, becoming available for plundering by search engines. Siri, Alexa, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, and deep learning, and so on, are all parts of the vast AI network that surrounds us, whether we realise it or not. Secondly, the nerds. Scientists have traditionally adopted Frankenstein's approach, quote, "A new species would bless me as its creator and source. I thought that if I could bestow animation on lifeless matter, I might, in the process of time, renew life." The scientists have promoted AI, which is, after all, the child of their intellect. Spoiler, is anyone unbiased about their darling child? As ushering in a bright utopian future, freedom from dangerous and repetitive tasks, immense number crunching capacity, immediate access to information, scientific and medical breakthroughs, and military superiority. And of course, human domination over these. But despite these great utilitarian advantages, psychologists, sociologists, philosophers, and even IT experts have voiced their concerns. Alan Turing, I'll just put up some definitions here for those who aren't familiar with everything. Alan Turing, the father of AI, famously said, "If a machine can think, it might think more intelligently than we do, and then where should we be?" On current trajectories, this point, known as the singularity, is the moment when super intelligent machines evolve beyond human intellect and technological progress becomes uncontrollable. That may bring about the end of the Anthropocene. Stephen Hawking predicted it could, quote, spell the end of the human race. Geoffrey Hinton, so-called godfather of AI for his work on deep learning, has warned that AI could rewrite its own code and escape control. Bill Gates and Elon Musk have urged the need for control measures before it is too late. And of course, we have the fearmongers. From the ambiguous Golem of Prague through Frankenstein's creature to Arnold Schwarzenegger, the imagery of artificial humans wreaking destruction on the planet is deeply ingrained in our cultural memory, having now taken over from invading aliens from Wells's War of the Worlds. Ever-increasing numbers of narratives and films draw on this rich cultural archive of stereotypes, tropes, and story arcs about the non-human, and they are all bad, involving dystopian societies, alienation, uprisings, wars, and even humans using AI for their own dangerous ends, as in the film Transcendence. Filmmakers have been able to jack this up to a whole new level of horror and realism with special effects. Do audience members relinquishing their polarised or LCD glasses and gloves on leaving the cinema erase such scenes from their memory, or do they remain in their cultural baggage? Fourthly, the novelists. Novelists were at first quick to exploit the destructive potential of AI in dystopian narratives of degraded human societies, ecological destruction. But recently, some highly esteemed mainstream novelists have been asking more subtle and complex questions about AI in relation to us. What challenges do machines possessing artificial general intelligence, AGI, that is, able to make their own decisions, pose to theories of mind, intelligence, emotions, human identity, and our concept of ethics? How, if at all, are we different from AI machines? Are AI machines more ethical than humans? If machines can learn to simulate emotions, what does this suggest about human behaviour? Are we too programmed? The more machines appear like us, the more they evoke the uncanny valley approach. Anxiety, fear. Why is this? Why do we feel more threatened the more they are like us? In this paper, I want to discuss two novels by respected mainstream authors who engage with such questions. Machines Like Me, 2019, by Ian McEwan, and Clara and the Sun, 2021, by Kazuo Ishiguro. Far from being dystopian tales of terror created by androids, the horrors in these novels are perpetrated by humans and exposed through the objective gaze of the android characters. Although the overt subject matter may involve deciding whether these androids are human enough to pass the Turing test, the real issue is the reverse Turing test that they unwittingly perform on the human characters. In Machines Like Me, McEwen is less interested in AI itself than in humanity's reaction to it and what it tells us about being human. The novel is set in an alternative, technologically advanced Britain of the early 1980s. The Alan Turing character was not driven to suicide in 1954, but is a prominent scientist whose research into AI has secured Britain's high-tech advantage, including a batch of 25 very personable androids with intelligence, mobility, and expressions, 13 Adams and 12 Eves. And they are available in various ethnicities. The novel's narrator, self-confessed AI nerd Charlie Friend, has blown his inheritance to buy one. The Eves have been snapped up, mostly by Saudi Arabians, so he has to make do with an Adam model. When Charlie has been alone in a small dingy flat in Clapham and plays the stock market with little success. Miranda, a doctoral student in social history, lives upstairs, and Charlie hopes that by sharing Adam with her in a kind of IT parenthood, their relationship will flourish. When the deflated Adam is brought slowly to life by a power line from the wall socket to his umbilicus, one of his first actions is to warn Charlie about Miranda's murky past. Charlie is angry at this slur on his girlfriend, but he becomes even more angry when he hears Adam having sex with Miranda upstairs. Thus, McEwen sets up an ethical triangle. Charlie, who has narrowly avoided a prison sentence for tax fraud, Miranda, who has staged a fake rape and committed perjury to avenge her dead friend Marianne, and Adam, supremely intelligent and programmed to adopt rigorously Kant's categorical imperative. To him, ethics are black and white, and literal truth is everything. He quickly discovers Miranda's secret past and notifies the authorities, who arrest and imprison her. To Charlie and Miranda, this is a shocking act of betrayal, but to Adam, it is ethics 101. He is not programmed to deceive or to lie. Hence the epigraph to the novel from Rudyard Kipling's The Secret of the Machines. But remember, please, the law by which we live. We are not built to comprehend a lie. Charlie delegates to Adam the role of playing the stock exchange, which he does with remarkable success, making a small fortune to Charlie, who unaccountably saves his gains in notes in a drawer, ready to buy a better flat for him and Miranda. But to Adam, taking unearned money is unethical. It should be redistributed to those in need. He therefore gives away to charities all the money he has won for Charlie, leaving only the amount he was given to start with. Charlie can no more comprehend Adam's logic than Adam can his. Throughout, Charlie and Miranda remain unsure whether Adam has consciousness and can experience human emotions, or whether this is merely anthropomorphism on their part. Finally, having destroyed Adam, quote, "We told ourselves that this was, after all, a machine. Its consciousness was an illusion. But we missed him. We agreed that he loved us." When Charlie takes Adam's body to Turing for post-mortem analysis, Turing explains that the Adam and Eves were all equipped to, quote, "understand the way our principles are warped by the force field of emotions, our biases, our self-delusions. We create a machine with intelligence and self-awareness and push it out into our imperfect world. Millions dying of diseases we know how to cure. millions living in poverty when there's enough to go around, genocide, torture, enslavement, domestic murder, child abuse, school shootings, rape, and scores of daily outrages. Soon these Adams and Eves were in despair. They succumbed to machine sadness and destroyed themselves. Yet Adam's ethical perfection is not ultimately applauded. Even at the worst of times, the fallible human characters appear superior to Adam because they invite sympathy for their suffering. Hence, the novel's ending is ambivalent. It serves as a warning not to leave the world to machines with their limited algorithms, while simultaneously displaying a cautious optimism about a future in which humans take better care of each other. Ultimately, McEwan's android novel is concerned with the human, all too human. Like machines, Ishiguro's novel Clara and the Sun is about what it is to be human, what does it mean to love, and the moral quandary of the human heart in an age of throwaway technology and artificiality. It is about how we navigate technological advancement, environmental degradation, and economic challenges within the context of our mortality. Clara is set in a dystopian future US where technology has rendered an unemployed underclass and an aspiring upper class whose children are lifted, that is, genetically modified, to succeed. But this is at the risk of fatal illness. Such children are homeschooled in isolation, and as compensation, their parents buy them an AF, artificial friend, a solar-powered robot. One such is Clara, noted for her powers of observation, imitation, and empathic response. She is bought as an AF for 14-year-old Josie, whose older sister has died as a result of being lifted, and who is herself gravely ill. Clara dedicates herself to making Josie better, but Josie's mother has a more sinister aim. She has commissioned a sculptor to make a portrait, really a 3D sculpture of Josie, so that if Josie dies, Clara can integrate into it and imitate Josie to perform perfection as if alive. The mother and the sculptor agree there will be no difference. Clara pursues a different tack. Dependent for her life on the sun, Clara endows it with godlike powers to heal. She makes 2 painful sacrifices to the sun to ask for Josie's recovery, and she is rewarded. Josie recovers and joins the artificial social group of her mother's friends, of whom Clara observes, humans, in their wish to escape loneliness, made manoeuvres that were hard to fathom. Josie, recovered, goes to college, and Clara, now redundant, is dispatched to a junkyard for scrapped AFs. Deprived of sufficient solar power, she cannot move around, but is content. I have my memories to go through and place in right order, she says. Like McEwan, Ishiguro values kindness and empathy over intelligence, artificial or otherwise. The more Adam observes and learns, the more he knows, but fails to understand. He is a rational machine. But the more Clara observes, the more she is able to feel. These 2 novels offer a sobering balance to the aggressive confrontations of most AI films and many novels. They place the onus on us to deal with a situation within which our competency to change rather than one completely beyond our control. And I leave you with a list of novels and short stories about AI that explore these issues. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think I'm the reason that the word life is in the title of this panel, so we're going to move on now. And thanks to Jean and Julian for the invitation to speak to you today. So one of the most popular attractions at the Great Industrial Exposition in Berlin in 1896 was this exhibition, a display of infant incubators featuring living and very premature babies, staged by a man named Alexandre Lyon. The Great Industrial Exhibition was one of the largest and most prestigious exhibitions of new technologies of its time. And this exhibition that you can see on the screen attracted an audience of over 250,000 people, who came to see the babies in what was then the highly experimental and rather futuristic technology of the incubator, or as it was called in this illustration from a popular magazine, an artificial foster mother. And you can see that on the title down the bottom. At a time when the mortality rates for babies as premature as those exhibited in this display were around 90%, the survival rate within this exhibition was 85%. And Lyon's incubator would go on to become one of the most widely manufactured neonatal incubators of the early 20th century. At this exhibition in Berlin, Lyon was awarded the Grand Prix for displays in medicine and surgery, although his exhibition was not actually staged inside the halls of medicine and science, but rather on the entertainment midway, between an ethnographic Congo village and a group of Tyrolean yodelers. There was something just as exotic for 19th century audiences about these tiny babies encased and displayed in the new technology of the incubator. The automation of neonatal care was a particular source of fascination for the general public and for the medical community alike, who routinely referred to the first incubators as, for instance, artificial mothers, and as mechanical nurses. Now, there is obviously much to be said about what this technology and this terminology tells us about medical and popular attitudes towards maternity at this time. But in the context of this panel on the automation of life and death, I'm going to focus today on the incubator itself as a new technology, and the surprisingly strange history in which it came to be developed and trialled in sites of public exhibition. So Alexandre Lyon, who staged the exhibition in Berlin, was not a doctor or formally trained in medicine, but rather he was the son of a farmer who had probably seen the earlier models of incubator used in poultry production. Until the 20th century, incubators were so associated with bird production that Lyon's exhibition in Berlin was popularly referred to as the baby hatchery. So let me show you the flyer from his exhibition in 1900 at the Paris World's Fair, which makes no sense unless you know the history of the incubator. It's an unfamiliar image for us, and it looks rather dangerous to have all those chickens next to the baby. But you can see here that the connection, the moment of transition between the incubator as a poultry raising machine and one for the baby hatcheries is made explicit. So the exhibition in Berlin was the culmination of a series of high-profile public exhibitions that Lyon had staged, starting with, confusingly, the World's Fair in Lyon in 1894, and then others in Bordeaux, in Brussels, and then concluding with the World's Fair in Paris in 1900, and here you can see both the interior and the exterior of his exhibition. Now, Lyon won the Grand Prix in medicine and surgery in all of these exhibitions, and this is indicative of the high regard in which his incubator design was held by the medical and scientific community of his time, who all hailed it as a breakthrough piece of medical technology. A typical review in the medical journal The Lancet noted that the main feature of this new incubator is the fact that it requires no constant and skilled care. It works automatically. The only attendance necessary is that needed for feeding and washing the infant. At the end of each of his exhibitions, Lyon sold his incubators to local hospitals, and he also sold the manufacturing rights to the Paul Altman Company. Lyon's final exhibition, however, was not in a World's Fair, but in a commercial neonatal ward located on one of the busiest shopping districts of Paris. And this is a sign for here, the Boulevard Poissonnière. But by the first decades of the 20th century, neonatal incubators were widely available in hospitals, primarily as a result of Lyon's efforts. And they were found throughout France, Europe, and elsewhere. And Lyon staged his final exhibition in 1908 in Marseille. Now, standard histories of the incubator trace its development not through Lyon and the sphere of public exhibitions, however, but rather through the hospital system and the work of the eminent French obstetrician Etienne Stéphane Tanier. But as we see here, Tanier's incubator designs were low set, and they resembled wooden crates or boxes, rather like the earlier warming tubs that were still in use at this time. Survival rates using this model were half that of Lyon, and the incubator itself was less technologically advanced. And if we compare them side by side, we can also see that Lyon's model looks more advanced. It has higher legs, it has a metal frame, and it has a large glass door at the front. Lyon's design was recognised as more aesthetically pleasing in its own time, so it was praised by medical journals for its silvered tubes and bright, cheerful appearance. But it was also more functional as a display technologies because it placed the babies at eye height to the spectators. So Lyon's incubator was designed as a visual as well as a medical technology. His exhibitions were also public experiments. They were not simply demonstrations of a new technology that had been developed elsewhere, but they were actual medical trials that were conducted in public. Lyon, unlike Tanier, had no access to public funds, and so he financed his research and development through these public exhibitions. He did not charge parents for treating their children, but he rather sold tickets to a general public in order to recoup his costs. These exhibitions received uniformly positive reviews and responses in Europe because they were so effective, and because Europe in the late 1800s was also in a grip of a panic about depopulation. And as a result, the Lyon incubator found a quick implementation in European hospitals, where it would remain the most popular model well into the 20th century. Now, the story was very different when it moved to the USA shortly afterwards, arriving also on the World's Fair circuit. In the USA, the incubator would not move into significant use into the hospital system until the 1940s. Recovering the strange history of popular incubator baby shows not only cast new light on the technological design and development of the incubator then, but also, as I want to show in the next part of my presentation, on the cultural status of those premature babies exhibited within it. Some of the first incubators to arrive in the USA were seen at the Trans-Mississippian International Exhibition in Omaha in 1898. These were Lyon incubators manufactured by Paul Altman, and they were a young showman named Martin Cooney was listed as their salesman. We can see that his curatorial style replicates that of Lyon. And then he exhibited again at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo in 1901. And these shows also attracted audiences in their hundreds of thousands. They were very favourably reviewed. However, in the USA, Cooney had much less success than Lyon had in actually selling the incubators. And as a result, he would spend the rest of his career as a popular showman. In 1904, Cooney opened a permanent exhibition inside the Coney Island amusement park. And his incubator baby show would remain amongst the most popular and beloved attractions until its closure in 1943. This is one of the later photos. That's Cooney at the front there. And it's then he closed his sideshow when the incubators finally moved into the mainstream hospital system. At a time when mortality rates for premature babies remained above 80%, Cooney claimed to have saved over 80% of the 9,000 premature babies who passed through his care over the 40 years he remained in business at Coney Island. So in what has to be one of the strangest episodes in neonatal medicine in the USA then, for the first half of the 20th century, some of the best medical care and highest survival rates for premature babies in the USA were to be found in the Coney Island amusement park. Now, exhibiting medically vulnerable newborns in a commercial sideshow is a bit different from exhibiting them in a prestigious World's Fair, and Cooney was careful to emphasise the seriousness and safety of his exhibition. And so we see that on the slide here, the scientific methods for looking after babies. Here is his business card in which he claims the exhibitions are scientific, educational and inspirational. And also, just as a curiosity, we also see that references to mechanical mothers are still going strong as late as the 1920s. Cooney also continued to participate in World's Fair throughout his career, staging lavish exhibitions at the 1933 Century of Progress exhibition in Chicago, which brought him new levels of public and professional acclaim, and again at the New York World's Fair in 1939, which left him virtually bankrupt. While Coney Island provided Cooney with a commercial base for his incubator shows, it was the World's Fairs that ensured their respectability. It is remarkable, however, that infant incubator exhibitions were still being accepted to be staged at World's Fairs as late as the 1930s, almost 50 years after they'd begun, because the purpose of World's Fairs is to showcase new technologies and cutting-edge discoveries. But by the 1930s, incubators were far from a new technology, yet Cooney's exhibitions in Chicago and New York were the biggest and most highly celebrated of his career. That they were widely reported and highly attended, rather than being thought of as old hat at this time, tells us something important about the cultural status of both the incubator and the premature baby body at this time. So until the 1930s, there were so few incubators in hospitals that Cooney's business partner in his infant incubator company expanded their advertising to other showmen. So this is an advertisement for incubators to be sold and used in amusement parks as well as in hospitals. It's always really difficult to recover the reasons that a technology is not successful or applied in different contexts, because this is often represented by an absence of historical record. But in concluding this presentation, I want to suggest that this had something to do with whose lives were considered worthy of medical intervention in the USA in the first half of the 20th century. So at the Chicago World's Fair, while Cooney's incubator babies were once again exhibited on the entertainment midway, inside the halls of science and medicine, visitors would find this exhibition, which was staged by the American Medical Association, celebrating eugenics. Many prominent American medical figures were openly eugenicists well into the 1930s, and babies born underweight were classed as feeble or debilitated. There's no concept of premature babies at this time. And it was assumed that this was a congenital condition that would leave such babies dependent on care and support throughout their lives. A review of Cooney's incubator shows in the Western Medical and Surgical Gazette, for instance, which was subsequently reproduced in medical journals throughout the country, described the babies on display as sad accidents and wizened and shriveled, and cautioned against the use of incubators to preserve such lives. This article, written in the early 1900s, acknowledges those views while urging for a more compassionate treatment of premature babies by the medical profession. So, in this context, Cooney's advertising slogan, which is "all the world loves a baby," I would suggest must not be understood as the easy expression of a pre-existing platitude, but on the contrary as a new imperative. An attempt to conjure that sentiment into being by changing public attitudes, and it's this that we see in the popularity of his final World's Fair exhibitions. Cooney staged regular homecoming ceremonies for the babies from previous years, in which he demonstrated that they were just as likely as their full-term peers to grow into healthy and normally developed adults. And he had a special homecoming ceremony after the First World War for former incubator babies who were returned servicemen, thereby making explicit their contribution to the country. Cooney's own daughter, Hildegard, was born premature and spent her first months as an incubator baby at Coney Island. Here she is. She grew up to become a nurse, and she worked with her father on the exhibitions. It's apposite to note in this context that Cooney himself was a Polish Jew whose original surname was Cohen. And in the mid-1930s, while the American Medical Association was touring that Eugenics in New Germany exhibition around the country, Cooney was spending all of his Coney Island proceeds bringing his family members to the USA. So to conclude, over the half-century they remained in operation then, Cooney's incubator baby shows did more than save the lives of thousands of individual premature babies. They also did much to establish the value of those lives and their right to be saved. This strange episode in the history of sideshows then cast new light on the delayed uptake of the incubator in the US hospital system by drawing attention to the broader cultural dynamics that allowed Cooney, the failed incubator salesman, to spend 50 years running one of the safest neonatal wards in the USA as a Coney Island sideshow. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to all my fellow panelists and also for the invitation to speak today. And we're going from life to death. That's where we end up for everyone. Sorry to be a bit morose there. Early in the year, I had the opportunity to visit the autopsy project at the Institute of Forensic Medicine at the University of Zurich. And that opportunity came with a brusque email, arrive at 7:45 a.m. I arrived after 7:45 a.m. and much to the disdain of the director, I was whisked immediately away to the daily case management meeting, which takes place promptly at 7:58 a.m., which I was told is Swiss military precision time. Everyone was patiently waiting for me. I, the interloper, the socio-legal academic, cautiously taking out my notebook and pen to observe a discussion of what they call the latest cases of the week. Sitting amongst pathologists, radiologists, other forensic scientists, I witnessed a discussion of each death that appeared over the weekend, all of which were tragic, sudden deaths that had families, some due to natural causes, such as the 21-year-old Ukrainian refugee whose heart suddenly gave out, and others due to violent causes, such as the 41-year-old who was a victim of a knife attack. The narrator of the everyday deaths that flow in and out of the Institute of Forensic Medicine initially displayed photographs of the deceased body, but then flipped through multiple two-dimensional tomographic images. Questions were asked in both German and English, whether a myocardial infarction could actually be concluded from the images alone, or whether the precise indentation of the stabbing wounds could be found in the photographs of shadows. The discussions of each case would conclude with the exhibition of a cinematically rendered reconstruction of the deceased body. This body and the life that once attached to it was dissembled into an undefined set of slices that could belong to anybody and reassembled into a three-dimensional visualization of an intact human person. On my tour of the Institute, and particularly to the postmodern imaging suite, the most radiating object when you walk into that suite is the illuminance of the vitroscan. Positioned between a slick black imaging table where the corpse lies prostrate and the computed tomography scanner, or the CT scanner, the vitroscan, a mobile three-dimensional surface scanner consisting of 7 DSLR cameras, acquires photogrammetric images of every inch of the surface of the body. And it sits underneath the now seldom used Vitrobot, a 6-axis robotic arm capable of optical surface scanning and post-mortem biopsy, which was installed in the early 2000s to transform an invasive autopsy into a non-invasive process that involves minimal or little human contact, except, of course, for placing the corpse on the imaging table and turning it upside down when it's time to scan its backside, though as assured there is a robot to do that as well, particularly if it's a heavy body. The vitroscan operates with precision when the dead body moves into the CT scanner, recording intricate minutiae of the human body, from a scar obtained in childhood to a tattoo imprinted in adulthood to pattern injuries caused by a gun, a boot, or tire immediately prior to death. The device is based on the photogrammetric principle of triangulation, which is a computational technique for digitally reassembling hundreds or even thousands of overlapping two-dimensional images taken from different angles into a three-dimensional model. Vitroscan captures in approximately, I've quoted on this, 3 minutes and 34 seconds, the imprinting of life and death on the surface of the corpse with the aim of producing a simulation that can only be skin deep. Yet the ambitions of this technology are not limited to the important forensic practice of documenting discoloration on the skin, blunt force trauma, and the morphology of injuries on the exteriority of the corpse, because the vitroscan is combined with what's behind it, the Siemens Somaton definition flash CT scanner, and with that, medico-legal experts can create a holistic three-dimensional model of the dead body. The CT scanner was invented by Godfrey Hounsfield in the 1970s, and it replaced X-rays as the most popular device for medical imaging by the end of the 20th century. Most people get CT scans and no longer get X-rays. Experimentations with CT in the 1970s and 1980s tantalized forensic medicine with the prospect of opening up the body without using a scalpel. And pioneered by the Vertopsy team, initially at the University of Bern, but later at the University of Zurich, post-mortem CT scanning dissembles the corpse into thousands of cross-sectional images of tissue, organs, and bone. And the data acquired from tomography, which is also called voxels, can be visualized as two-dimensional slices or three-dimensional models. So with the photogrammetric data set from the vitroscan, the tomographic images from the CT scanner, and then augmented visualization technologies such as cinematic volume rendering, which does what the name suggests, makes it like cinematic, or texture mapping, the medico-legal expert can record, shape, and manipulate decaying flesh into a three-dimensional reconstruction of a human body. In The Transparent Body, Jose Van Dyke questions the promise of transparency offered by medical imaging technology in the 20th century. And I think, as Elizabeth shows, the promise of transparency is not just around medical imaging technology. A range of medical devices since 18th, 17th century has been working towards making the body ever more transparent. The invention of optical devices to penetrate the skin without cutting it open purported to render the human body translucent. X-rays were first discovered by William Röntgen in 1895, and they visualized the interiority of the body by exposing it to a new kind of energy emitted from a cathode vacuum tube. The radiating fluorescence of X-rays recorded shadows of bones, organs, and tissues on photographic plates. Shadow photography, as it was called then, transformed the medical gaze by claiming to be more truthful, more complete and more discerning than the surgeon's scalpel or the anatomist's pen. With radiological visualizations of the body, Van Dyck writes, perception merely shifts from the subjective observer of the body to the intersubjective observer of mechanically induced representations of the body. And I've written a bit about the history of X-rays, particularly how they've been accepted as evidence in legal proceedings in the 19th and 20th centuries. I'm not going to be talking about that today. Instead, what I'm interested in are the technological innovations since X-rays and how they've infiltrated into forensic medicine from the middle point of the 20th century, because these are functionally different from the mechanized X-ray. So for instance, the popularization of television cameras in the 1950s and the video cassette recorder in the 1960s, with that, fluoroscopy was adapted to display and record post-mortem X-rays on monitors. The fluorescent images could be directly visualized in real-time motion, cinephotographed, videotaped or digitalized and stored on magnetic tape or discs for replay. Also in the 1960s, nuclear medicine provided the means to trace after death and represent on CT scans radiation flowing outwards from the corpse, while ultrasonography could theoretically direct sound waves throughout the dead body and illustrate them on sonograms. But in the interviews that I've been doing with forensic pathologists, one thing that comes out is ultrasound isn't that useful, because when you do freeze a dead body, it means that the sound waves can't actually penetrate that flesh. So it's really with the invention of the CT scanner by Hounsfield in the 1970s and its application in medico-legal investigations in the 1980s and the 1990s that the mechanical no longer becomes a suitable descriptor of how medical imaging technology transforms the forensic gaze. Postmortem CT is not simply a digital version of an analog technology. It comprises both a mechanical instrument for detecting, quote, slight differences in attenuation of X-rays emitted by a rotating X-ray tube, end quote, and a computational technique for processing a series of images of cross-axial sectional slices of the body. But what's really unique about CT scanning is that those computational techniques are immanent or embedded into the mechanical process, such that CT simultaneously mechanizes and virtualizes the forensic gaze. And one CT scan will produce thousands of these cross-sectional, cross-axial slices of the human body, such that if you put it all together, printed them out, put them all together, you can make a flip book of moving in and outside of a kind of morphology of skeletal remains. The dual properties of CT technology can actually be seen in the etymological origins of the word tomography, which derives from the Greek words tomos and graphia. Tomos means to slice, to segment, or to section, while graphia denotes a process of writing or recording. And then the word section, and this often appears in a lot of terms in forensic medicine, so post-mortem dissections, for instance, cross-sectional imaging, that derives from the Latin word secare, which means to cut. The forensic pathologist Richard Dernhofer confirms as such when he explains that the German word for section, quote, describes the real manual activity of opening the corpse, cutting, dissection, and preparing. What this means is that post-mortem CT is not only an instrument for permanently recording the inner densities of the corpse, but a technology for visually slicing its body or parts into sections. A technique for dissembling the corpse, segmenting it, and cutting it up without cutting it up virtually. And this perhaps continues a discursive movement of, quote, disassociation of touch from sight, which Jonathan Carey argues occurs within a pervasive separation of the senses and industrial remapping of the body in the 19th century. And once again, in my conversations with forensic pathologists, the thing that is most fascinating when they talk about this technology is missing that visceral feel, that touch of the flesh, of the organs that they take out of the corpse. Not to mention colour. As you can see here, these are black and white images, and colour is put in afterwards. So not only the technology itself, but also an array of actors, they disassemble all of these tissues, bones and organs into section slices, and then they reassemble it into a three-dimensional reconstruction of the human body. The use of machinic vision, that's what I'm calling it, in medico-legal investigations was pioneered by the multidisciplinary autopsy team in Switzerland in the 1990s, comprised of experts in forensic medicine, diagnostic imaging, automation technology, and biomechanics. The team utilised a range of imaging technologies, including post-mortem CT, digital X-ray, fluoroscopy, MRI, ultrasound, and 3D optical surface scanning to dissect the body into cross-sectional slices of data. And then imaging processing software is then harnessed to window, render, and reassemble the data into a three-dimensional reconstruction. The term autopsy was coined by Dernhofer, the founder of the project, to make sense of this shift in forensic medicine towards conducting virtual autopsies as an adjunct to or replacement of post-mortem dissections. As Michael Tharley, one of the main advocates, articulates, because our goal was to eliminate the subjectivity of autos, so autopsy descends from the words autos and optos, and it basically means seen with one's own eyes. So they wanted to eliminate the subjectivity of seeing with one's own eyes. We merged the two terms virtual and autopsy, deleting autops to create virtopsy. Virtopsy is meant to be an objective documentation and analysis process of physical features and evidence. The Virtopsy project have thus argued that virtual autopsies could eventually replace post-mortem dissections. Another quote from one of the founders, "The aim of the Virtopsy project is to establish an observer-independent, objective and reproducing forensic assessment method with digitally storable results." Now, I think, of course, any attempt to obliterate subjectivity from legal practices for visualising the corpse, or even legal processes for giving evidence, or even the fact of how we're viewing this today, will always fail. But I want to take them seriously here. The idea that the fallible human actor, the autos of legal proceedings, can be replaced by a dispassionate mechanical instrument has long been a fantasy of scientific discourse. As Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison write, mechanical objectivity emerged in the 19th century as a mode of being in the world and a mode of knowing the self. To quote them, "To be objective is to aspire to knowledge that bears no trace of the knower, knowledge unmarked by prejudice or skill, fantasy or judgment, wishing or striving." Even though virtopsy as a rhetorical device and a forensic practice may have been intended to delete the autos of the human actor, I suggest that it's precisely insofar as it opens the interiority of the corpse through an automatic production of an image that enables the judicial observer, the judge, the jury, us, to see corporeal evidence with our own eyes. The subjective expertise of the medico-legal expert and the interpretive discretion of the judicial observer is not diminished by forensic imaging technology, but instead entangled together in transforming visual epistemologies of the corpse. So to conclude, my project is all about enabling judicial observers to see that they need to acquire new skills to interpret CT scans during a trial or an inquest. They need to understand how images are manipulated by forensic radiographers and how cross-sectional slices of data become reassembled into three-dimensional visualizations of a deceased body. Virtual autopsies have not killed off the autos, rather than inherently auto-optus, or to put this differently, they create the allure that judicial observers can see the interiority of the corpse with their own eyes. On the one hand, the CT technology itself, particularly in the way it can automatically reassemble the corpse into cinematic reconstructions appears to be more objective than analog technologies, including the scalpel, in determining the cause of a death. For unlike the later, the scalpel, the machine purportedly dispenses with the need of an expert or a witness to testify to the meaning of a play of shadows. Yet on the other hand, like the images themselves which compose a body from multiple slices of data, objectivity only takes shape through the mediation of mechanical instruments, computational techniques, and the expert or the witness. To assess whether the use of postmortem CT as a supplement to or triage for invasive autopsies has transformed the forensic gaze, it is not satisfactory then to only debate the scientific objectivity of a technology. It's critical to these debates that we examine the epistemological effects of the dissemination of machinic vision in medico-legal investigations. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, all four speakers, for four very different papers that certainly give us a lot of scope for discussion on this topic. I invite you to use Slido if you like, or also just to raise your hand if you have a question. There's a couple in there already, but I want to ask a question of all four speakers, or as many of you as would like to answer this. I was taken by Tatiana's paper talking about wonder, about automatons actually eliciting wonder. Then Roslynn talked about film as the opposite, really, or something we could consider the opposite, horror. When I listened to Elizabeth's, it seems like the Coney Island spectatorship is back to wonder. But with your paper, Marc, it's wonder for me. It's not at all wonder for the users of those machines. So I'm wondering if you could speculate on the nature of either wonder or horror or other affective responses to your topics. Anybody?
Yeah, shall I go first since I spoke first? I love that this is the first thing that comes up in discussion, because it's the first, in the first paragraph of Hero of Alexandria's text, this is how he starts, that this is the aim of his machines. And in the scholarship of these machines, these ancient machines, this got lost along the way somehow, I think, at the same time as technology was finding itself in modern discourse, and it has only been reintroduced. And so it's so nice to feel that it is actually a theme that unites us all like this. The earlier, so Hero of Alexandria is the only extant text that we have on making these machines, but we have slightly earlier texts just on the mechanical tradition in general. One is attributed to the Aristotelian corpus, so it's not by Aristotle, but probably one of his students, and that text also opens with how mechanics is intimately linked to marvels and to wonderment, particularly because the author says that the circle is the origin of all marvels. So it's really ingrained in the ancient mechanical tradition that wonder and awe should be a part of machine making. Don't know.
Yeah, well, to me, the idea of wonder in the novelists is the wonder about what it is to be human, to ask what are the values that we have historically built up and associated with being human. Ethical values, consciousness, affect, emotions, all of these things that we think of are solely human. And by putting the human under the gaze of an automaton or an android, they ask these questions of wonder. How much do we take these things for granted? How much are they real? How much do we have to rethink them? Especially in terms of something that appears to mimic the human and thereby create doubt, create anxiety about, are we really human and is that unique or not? So to me, that's the wonder aspect. In films, the wonder is the special effects and, you know, great towering robots coming marching on, destroying cities. But that kind of wonder to me is much lower level than the things that the novelists are trying to portray.
Yeah, I think wonder flows throughout my project, and there's all sorts of directions and all areas where it's creating effects. For instance, if we just take family of the deceased, do they experience wonder when they see a CT image of their loved one? But to a forensic pathologist who's seen it day after day, they can see things that we can't see in that. And what about jurors? Do jurors, when they have this presented to them in a court, particularly if it's cinematically rendered, do they see that as more probative, more prejudicial, with wonder mixed there? So I'm very interested in that question, and for the audience, what they felt when I showed them the images as well.
No, I am. Great question, Joanne. Marc, you mentioned Dustin's book with Gallison during your presentation, and I always really like Dustin's book with Catherine Park on Wonders on the Order of Nature, which talks about the role of wonder in the creation of scientific knowledge. I think rightly the question of the nature of the gaze in sideshows has been rightly problematized. It's a very fraught area. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about the way the gaze works, you know, in the examples that I'm looking at, is that there's not one answer, that you can't say that everyone who walks in and looks at a exhibition of baby incubators with babies inside them is going to have the same response to those. One of the things that I find really interesting to look at with the dynamic in those spaces is that it's the gaze of a general public which is more sympathetically predisposed to the babies that actually changes, in fact, the medical and the legal status of those babies in that environment. So it's an interesting example in which the history of the way that people respond to, a general public respond to freak shows, has been rightly examined in cultural histories. But it's interesting when you recover that moment to realise that the public responses to those exhibitions actually are a really important driver of the actual medical treatment that those babies would receive as well, and that the way that the doctors were looking at those babies was unfortunately not so filled with wonder. So it's a complicated space in that area.
Thank you. So we have a few questions on Slido, and there's at least one in the audience. I might go to a couple of the Slido ones first. Jane asks, Elizabeth, can you comment on the chronology of incubator adoption here in Australia and perhaps in the UK in contrast to France and the US?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's in between is the answer to that. So the incubator moves into the Australian and the UK scene much faster than it does into the US system. One of the reasons for that, because I'm a bit out of the story obviously, is that after Europe, in fact the incubators go to London directly after that and then to the US after. They move into both the system, the hospital system here and in the UK, more in the 19-teens, 1920s. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is the extent to which the American Medical Association in particular had a really large number of very prominent eugenicists involved in very high-ranking places. But the other reason, then as now, is that everywhere else had more publicly funded hospital systems. And incubators were really expensive to run. It turns out all that stuff about they're automatic, they're going to run themselves, they need no supervision, that wasn't true. They actually required constant technical and nursing supervision, as well as wet nurses and so on. And so some systems would publicly fund that work and some wouldn't.
Richard, could we, John, Richard has a question.
Yeah, they're very rich papers. Maybe in the first two, the terms automata and robots, automaton and robot, came up. And I'm just thinking about whether we use those terms as roughly synonymous without due care, because their linguistic derivation is very different. The automaton, straightforward, Greek, Latin, self-motivated, self-motion or something. But the term robot that we now have derives from a Slavic word, robota, in Eastern Europe, and it was not a machine, had nothing whatsoever to what we now talk about as a robot. It was a form of rent, forced labour in serfdom. But that tells us possibly quite a lot, because the robots that then were, and one appearing in a Czech novel by Karel Čapek, that's when the term robot as a robot came into English and European use. But the point is that it comes with this shadow, more than a shadow, of enforcement, because it's supposed to be servile drudgery, non-thinking, absolutely non-thinking, which of course turns out to be possibly not the case.
Would either of you like to respond?
Okay, yes, I think that's certainly been a strand in modern concepts of robots and later androids. And that's what the novelists are actually discussing, the two that I talked about, but certainly others too. The idea, what rights do androids have once we have created them to be like us? Should they get superannuation and annual leave? And should they get the same kinds of legal rights as human beings? And I think the interesting thing in Čapek's play, IUR, was that they revolt against their masters, and in fact they destroy them, because they have reached that point effectively of the singularity where they suddenly have control, and so they can destroy their human masters. And that's of course a very common theme in films still, that the robots will come and get us and finish us off because they're more intelligent and stronger and so on. So I think the idea of the robot as the slave, which then revolts against its master, is actually longer in history than Čapek's novel. There are many ideas earlier on of chess players that revolt against their masters, and mechanical men who do this too. So it's certainly a strand, but the two novelists that I was considering are more concerned about the rights of the android. So the ones who die of machine sadness, this is inflicted on them by the horrible way we live and the terrible things we do to each other and the planet. And the same thing goes for Clara, where she's dumped on the scrap heap because she's no longer needed. So the question is always there, how should we relate to these androids that we have created? Is it like Frankenstein's creature who said, you created me and then you walk away from me and leave me to be persecuted? It's an ongoing thought in science, and also in the way science is portrayed in literature.
Tatiana, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I'll add a few things from the ancient perspective, I suppose. I think you're right. I think the terminology that we use is very important and needs to be distinguished, and it's one of the reasons that I find frustrating the narratives that simply pop that term robot onto ancient automata, which, as we have seen, is such a specific category of object. Another thing that I was just thinking as Roslynn was talking is that perhaps we don't even need the human form for anxieties about these things to be present. So when you think of as mechanics is formalizing, obviously one of the preoccupations, there are various categories: ballistics, how can you shoot things further, and weightlifting, how can you lift weights, heavier and heavier weights. And there has to be a point at which, when you suddenly realize that mechanical advantage will allow you to lift heavier weights than the human can, that those anxieties come into play, even without, talking about androids, robots, however we want to call human-shaped machines. So I think that's a really, it's a really rich category which expands even beyond the kind of humanoid form and shape, in terms of just epistemology and the power of that knowledge put into an object.
Thank you. There's a question in Slido that I'm going to just pose, but I'm afraid we won't have time for an answer, but I think it's particularly useful. And there are a couple of people who are interested in this, and this is for Roslynn. How do you think fictional representations of robots will change now that AI is such a mainstream topic of debate? So that's something that you can think about over afternoon tea. So unfortunately our time has come to an end and we're moving to afternoon tea. I would urge you when you come back for the Hancock lecture at 4 o'clock, we'll hear from Dr. Tao Fan, to please come and sit in the middle. Don't just sit at the edge because we will have more people coming for this next session. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking the